other terns. The next session will be on tracking studies part 2, and I'm going to turn it over to Keenan to take over leading this session.
Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. I'm excited about this session, and to kick everything off, we're going to have Rafael Revorêdo joining us from Brazil, and a real special thanks to Rafa as he's in the middle of kind of his tracking campaigns and capturing birds down in Brazil. So definitely appreciate him joining us today. And he's going to be filling us in about some GPS tracking work and focusing on migration of roseate terns in Brazil. Take it away, Rafa. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Keenan. Thank you, everybody. So I bring an overview of our last year campaign, our last year efforts, and tagging and tracking some birds here from Brazil, and what we have been obtaining with what kind of data we have been putting together. We're still putting together some analysis, deep analysis, and especially as part of my PhD, also go a little bit deeper in some local movements. So I would be bringing just a bigger overview and highlights of the birds that you tagged in 2025. So let me see if it's working.
Not going forward.
So,
there you go.
Oh yeah, now moved. Hopefully, yeah.
Sorry, you got it now.
Thanks. So the goal of this study was trying to understand a little bit of the movement, the northbound migration, but also especially local movement of the roseate terns in Brazil, trying to understand a little bit better the time they spend here and where they forage, where they rest, where's the main roosting spots, if there's any kind of during their non-breeding period in Brazil, in this non-breeding area, if there's any kind of migration based in months, if they change location, if some groups stay in a place, some groups go to other places and stay there the entire winter. There's a lot of open questions to understand these movements in the wintering grounds, in the non-breeding grounds. So this is the main goal of all these efforts that you have been putting together for some years now. And for doing this, really differently from tagging a bird in the breeding areas that you can go to the nest, find the bird you want, and trap it with a trap, we have a lot of luck in the process and persistence and patience and misnetting them in the areas that they are supposed to roost at night. In Galinhos especially, there's a lot of sandbanks available, so this makes things even more challenging because we need to have a lot of variables, perfect matching like high tide, new moon, so it's dark, the other sandbanks are covered, and we also figure out that using calls, using speakers close to the nets makes our chance of getting the birds much higher. So we have been using this, and basically even when birds are not resting in the area that we are capturing, we just let the calls on during the time of the capturing, and this attracts some birds that are trying to find some spots for resting. So last year we deployed 15 path track GPS tags using lag loops after misnetting them in Galinhos, and we installed base stations in the main roosting spots that we identified based in previous movement location for offloading the data. As you can see here to the methods, John Lyons putting some misnets and checking. This is part of an article that describes precisely how was the 2025 campaign in Galinhos. It's a really nice article in the Album magazine, so I invite you to read if you didn't read yet. But why Galinhos? So Galinhos is, as many of you already know, is one of the main roosting spots for roseate terns in Brazil that we know, and in the past have been really known because roseate terns have been colliding with power lines there, and this brought our attention. This collisions problems was reported in this recent paper in the Waterbirds magazine and journal in September of last year. I also invite you to read a little bit more about the situation. And now it's the biggest case of seabird collision and power line infrastructure in the South America that we know. So it's really important. Local movement for these birds in the area has really high value for understanding, for conservation. All right, let's go to the initial results. This is a big overview of the data that we obtained. I put here some contrasts and some complementation with data from 2024 campaign also. So in 2025, we got 5 completely migration of roseate terns. And we got 14 actually data back from the base stations, from the tags, but entire migratory path we got for just extra 4 animals. Now we have a total of 7 animals that we have the complete northbound migration. And Keenan will talk a little bit more about the things that I highlighted here, which is basically overlap with some planned or leased in case of the US offshore wind development. So I brought this first map just for bringing this overview. And I highlighted some the maps are a little bit heavy. West for patience for let's see. Well, so I highlight one of the things that I highlighted was when the birds are crossing Caribbean for these birds that we got the migratory data complete. So they basically do a really similar path. I will talk a little bit more about the bird ID 2018. It's a bird from Maine, W56. It developed a completely different, a little bit different path during, but mainly the birds just go up a little bit, crossing Trinidad and Tobago, and cross the middle center of the Caribbean Sea, and go to Puerto Rico, and then start to go up really straight line. This is really similar what we observed for 2024 birds, unless because in 2024 we have a bird that had a loop. We still don't know why this happened, but it's basically the same spots that they crossed during this migration. And in 2025 birds, we got 2 new birds from probably from the Caribbean population. And this data from how these birds use the Caribbean area is different from these birds that just migrate, crossing the Caribbean Sea in direction to the US and Canada. And if my computer asks for the next map. Yeah, so you can see in the left side in your screen, this is 3 birds that actually just went until achieved the Caribbean and stayed there during the breeding period. We don't have, by this movement data, any indication of breeding activity, so we can't actually say these birds are from Caribbean population. They could be from the northeastern, the Atlantic northeastern population, but they are just skipping maybe the breeding time and staying in the Caribbean for this year. So we can't affirm this based just in the movement data, but we can see that they use differently from the birds that just cross and during the migration this area in the Caribbean. And I think this is really interesting. We want to go deep a little bit more into this data and understand how these birds are using. But basically in Trinidad and Grenadines, Santa Lucia, Guadeloupe, the British Virgin Islands are the main spot that these birds spend the time during the breeding season before coming back to Brazil. But also, I would like to highlight the first data that you got for a completely north and southbound migration. Is this bird from Maine, 2018, 218, the bird code, W56 is his name. And basically, the northbound migration follows much more stopover sites in the Caribbean. And these birds especially had a stop on south of Cuba before going directly to Maine. But in the southbound migration, when these birds are coming back, it straight line crossed directly almost until Suriname, Venezuela, Suriname, when actually started to doing some stopovers. So the southbound migration, it seems, at least based on this only one individual that we have, really more straightforward than the northbound migration. And for local data, yeah, so local data from 2025 in red and in 2024 is in yellow. They are really similar just visually. You can see this is just the coast of Rio Grande Norte State where I am. So it's the movement pattern is visually you can see and you can say it's pretty consistent. So 2025 data confirmed what we already have been observing for 2024, and maybe with just a little bit of displacement to the east, but not really visual. So it's pretty consistent with 2024, and basically what we observe in 2024 is these behaviors where the birds just roost and the coast, commute to the areas from 30 to 8 kilometers far from the coast, and just foraging this area near from the 100 meters Isobat, and then coming back for the roosting spots at night. These movements usually occurs the commuting moment occurs between 4 and 7 a.m. and then the birds are coming back from the foraging areas from around 5 and 7 p.m. for roosting. And this is also the between 6 and 7 to 8 p.m. our best mist netting moments for these birds. And also, we have been showing already with 2024 data that the commuting is the main overlapping behavior with the planned offshore wind in Brazil. For 2026 plans, so I can finish, we already are ongoing. I just came back from field Wednesday and I already have 5 birds tagged. We still want to tag 15 more. I'm going back to field on this Saturday to keep going. And also this year we want to tag for the first time 10 capped terns. I just put this here. If anybody else has interest in other species, we can talk about too in the future. It works. We still didn't capture any capped terns. And basically that's it. I would like to thanks everybody that support these activities and this research. And I'll be available at the end of the section for answering any question. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Rafa. Really fun to see what you've been working on and to be a part of that as well. I don't think that we're going to have any time for questions right now, but hopefully we'll have time at the end of the session to address anything that anybody might have for Rafa. For now, I think we'll jump right into my talk. So I'll start sharing my screen. All right. All right. Can everybody see that okay? Hopefully that's working. For my talk today, I'm going to be focusing on some work that we've been doing with Bayesian models to kind of re-estimate some of the GPS-derived flight height data that we're getting from these tags that Rafa just introduced us to. Before I get into that, I just want to acknowledge my co-authors, Rafael, Katie Stoner, John Herbert, Don Lyons, and Joan Walsh, as well as the various institutions that really made this work possible. The Roseate Tern, of course, for this group does not need too much of an introduction, but the one thing that I want to focus on is that we know a lot about the ecology of the species on its breeding grounds in the Northwest Atlantic, but we do not know too much about the specific migratory routes and wintering behavior of the species. We're especially lacking high-resolution GPS data from the species that's sorely needed to help assess potential risks. And one of those big risks is, of course, offshore wind development, especially in the mid-Atlantic and the New York Bight. And that's where we think Roseate terns may be overlapping with offshore wind development the most. As I'm sure we'll hear more about from Peter coming up next, we're not too worried about the species during the breeding season overlapping with offshore wind, both around Massachusetts and in the Gulf of Maine. But we are quite worried about this migratory period and where and when they could be overlapping with forthcoming and ongoing construction in these lease areas. So what we do know from some of the work that Carolyn and Ian led deploying geolocator devices on roseate terns is that during the fall migration, it seems like roseate terns really jump off from Cape Cod and head right down to the Caribbean, pretty much directly over the sea and outside of the U.S. economic exclusive zone in the high seas, so out of the way of offshore wind development. There was some indication in those geolocator tracks that they tended to drift a bit closer to the coast and potentially within offshore wind lease areas during the springtime, however. And I think the same migratory pattern was really we saw this well with that individual that Rafa showed us that went due south in the fall, and then in the spring came up hugging the coast more. What we do know about roseate tern flight height at this time has been based off of visual observations and VHF telemetry studies that Pam led. And those studies suggested that a lot of the roseate tern flight heights during the breeding and pre-migratory staging period were below 25 meters. And if we compare this to the expected rotor swept zone heights, where these birds could potentially collide with turbine blades, that's between about 27 and 306 meters. So that's below the collision risk area with those turbine blades. However, there have been some visual observations over the years from either vessels or on shore of migratory flight heights of roseate terns and common terns over 150 meters. So those specific flight heights are a bit concerning when it comes to potential overlap with rotor swept zones. So our first objective was to identify those northbound migratory routes and potential overlap with offshore wind and energy planning areas. I'm not going to get too much into the details. I think Rafa covered them well, but all these birds were captured in Galinhos, and then we tracked them up to their breeding sites in the Northwest Atlantic. Just to give you another quick overview of the tagging, we've been deploying PathTrack PicoFix GPS tags. These weigh under 3 grams, and they're less than 3% of roseate tern body mass. They've been taking a 30-minute GPS fix rate, and that data that the GPS tag is collecting is then offloaded via a UHF signal to small base stations that you can see on the bottom right picture of these slides, not only in Brazil, but also breeding sites in North America, in the US and in Canada. And these tag deployments, as Rafa mentioned, have occurred in February and March of the past 2 years, and we've deployed 15 tags each year. So as Rafa was showing earlier, these migratory flights come up along the Atlantic coast, where they overlap with offshore wind energy development, not only the lease areas, but also the planning areas. These planning areas have been rescinded by the current administration, but I thought that it was still important to show potential overlap with these planning areas, and of course the lease areas where there's currently construction ongoing in some of them, including sites just south of Massachusetts, where that pink individual is overlapping with. I also just wanted to point out that we've gotten some more recent data from PathTrack that Rafa wasn't able to show on his slides. This pink bird, which is from Country Island, Nova Scotia. So it's really exciting to add this data to our data set. Overall, we've seen quite a bit of overlap with offshore wind lease areas. And if we look, one of the things that we did was we took these track lines from Roseate terns and we calculated the amount of intersect that they had with planning areas and lease areas, and we summed those up across time, space and time. And we have some individuals that have a lot of overlap with lease and planning areas. Some individuals may cross through as many as 10 lease areas, and totaling over 100 kilometers flown through lease areas during a single migration. So one of our concerns is that this could really accumulate over time, considering the roseate tern is, of course, a long-lived species. But kind of the next question, of course, that comes up is, can we assess overlap of roseate tern flight heights with those offshore wind turbine blades in the rotor swept zone? GPS-derived altitude data is inherently messy, especially the PathTrack data. So we have to do some refinements to those data using a variety of different modeling techniques. The first step that we wanted to do to refine estimates of roseate tern flight height were to remove stationary periods where we knew the birds were resting on the sandbanks or on the water using hidden Markov models. Once those were removed, the remaining data that we had was from in-flight periods, whether that be commuting or migratory periods or foraging periods during their migration, using Bayesian state space models, which have been used by some other folks in the literature as well. For their process model, we used a log normal distribution, and for our observation model, we used a Cauchy distribution, which is kind of like a normal distribution with really long tails. And the observation error was related to the number of satellites used for each GPS fix. So if they connected to more satellites in the constellation, then we assumed that there was less error associated with those altitude estimates. And we use uninformative priors for all model parameters. So the first thing that I want to show you is the modeled posterior of flight height. So this is kind of the full range of modeled iterations from the Bayesian model. So the full range of possibilities of roseate tern flight heights from our data. The median flight height throughout this migratory period was only 6.5 meters, so quite low, especially relative to rotor swept zone heights. 50% of those iterations fell between 2.5 and 16 meters, and 95% of them fell between about 0 and 112 meters. There were some flights that were over 1,000 meters, but those were quite rare. Most of them are under 100 meters. And I will mention that 13% of these iterations did overlap with the rotor swept zone. We can also think about this in a slightly different way, where we can look at individual flight height estimates across time for a single individual. So this bird that I want to highlight departed from Puerto Rico on April 28th and then arrived to Great Gull Island on May 3rd. Each one of these bars is a 30-minute interval where we got a height estimate of its position. And then the darkest blue bar is the 50% credible interval, followed by the 75% and the 95% credible interval. And then we have shaded dark day and night. And what you can see is most of these flight heights, even over open water, are quite low. But the big thing that I want you to take away from this is that most of those credible intervals do overlap with the lower end of the rotor swept zone, that minimum tip height, which is shown by this dashed bar that goes through all those flight heights. So that's one of our biggest concerns as of right now. We can also think about this in a slightly different way, where of course we know in reality that a Roseate tern that's migrating through or past any of these offshore wind areas could be above the rotor swept zone, within it, or below it. But because there's a lot of error that's associated with each of these flight height estimates, what we can more confidently say is if we look at those credible intervals, those 95% credible intervals, we can kind of say, are they crossing the minimum tip height or the upper tip height? So if we break these out and we break out the percentage of individual flight height estimate 95% credible intervals that cross the minimum tip clearance, we see that 55% of those estimates actually cross the minimum tip clearance, which is quite concerning to us. And 43% of them are actually below. So most of these flight heights are really low relative to that rotor swept zone. So getting into discussion and conservation implications, one of our big discoveries is that it seems like the coastal route, especially in the Mid-Atlantic Bight and New York Bight, are favored during spring migration, which means that during that spring migration, there could be increased exposure to offshore wind development. Most of those Roseate tern flight heights are below expected rotor swept zone, but of course we need to consider uncertainty. But ultimately, one thing that we need to consider here is that collision risk does not just depend on the flight height of these Roseate terns. It will depend on avoidance behaviors, and that's at the macro and meso scale. So if they're avoiding a whole project or single turbines, but then also those last second avoiding of turbine blades if they're very close. We don't have those values, and it's difficult to estimate collision risk without good values. So we need additional data from different tag types to refine flight height estimates. And then we need to know where, when, and why Roseate terns are occasionally flying at higher altitudes, which will take additional analyses. So we're currently wrapping this up, and we have a draft of a new publication highlighting this work that we'll hopefully be submitting for review soon. So keep an eye out for that work coming in the coming months. And I'd like to finish up by just acknowledging, especially the folks on various islands where these tagged Roseate terns ended up coming back and breeding, because all these folks are really instrumental in downloading that data, and the work wouldn't have been possible without them, as well as the other various institutions that made this work possible. All right. So I think I have time for about one or two questions if we have any. And otherwise, we'll be moving on to Peter. Jeff, I see you have your hand up. You can go ahead.
Yeah, that last question you had on the slide about when are the birds likely to be flying up, I've noticed that when they're being scared by predators, particularly peregrines and merlins, they frequently will fly up into what I think is the rotor swept zone based upon my position on the ground. They don't do it often, but when those birds, predatory birds, come by, they do frequently fly up much higher.
Yeah, definitely. Unfortunately, because of the sampling rate of the tags, it's hard to really detect any really quick responses from the birds, since we're only gathering GPS and flight height estimates every 30 minutes. So it's hard to say, it's hard to look at responses like that, but it's definitely possible that they're doing things like that along their migratory route as well. I see a question from Evan in the chat. I think maybe I'll email you to address that, since we're kind of running out on time. And same with Holly. I think we'll jump over to Peter's talk so we can stay on time. And if we have additional time at the end of the session, then we can get into some other questions. So next up, we have Peter Payton, who's going to be sharing some work using common tern, looking at the potential of using common terns as a surrogate species for tagging projects with Roseate terns. So we'll let him jump on.
Hi, is that working?
Yes, looks good. Thanks, Peter.
Great. So thanks, Keenan. So I want to thank my co-authors, Keenan and Don, but in particular, Juliet Lamb, who's the brains behind this operation and did all the analysis that I'm presenting today. And I also wanted to thank the New York Sea Grant, who funded this research. So one of the questions we have is, when you simultaneously track roseate and common terns during the breeding and post-breeding periods, how do the movements and space use of these two species differ? And are there similarities in the annual variation of the movements between these two species during the breeding and post-breeding periods? And can you use these high-resolution movements of common terns as a surrogate for the endangered roseate tern? If we could just track common terns, will that give us some indication of what the roseate terns are doing? And this could, as Keenan just alluded to, can be useful for a lot of things, just looking at assessment of offshore wind areas, where key foraging areas, a lot of questions we might have about the movement dynamics of these two species. So this research was conducted on Great Gull Island, which Margaret already talked about before. So at the time of the research, there was a little over 11,000 pairs of common terns nesting on Great Gull Island, and about a little over 2,300 pairs of roseate terns nesting on the island. So it's an ideal place to conduct this type of research. For those of you who don't know, Great Gull is at the eastern edge of Long Island Sound, just south of New London, Connecticut, near the tip of Long Island. And also, as Keenan just showed you in the previous graphs, it's near a lot of 13 planned or operational wind farms in the mid-Atlantic and New York, Bight, and other areas. So it's an ideal place to conduct this research. So in 2024, we were lucky to have Keenan come down and work with Juliet. Juliet has a ton of experience tagging a wide variety of species, but it was great to have Keenan with his expertise in tagging roseates and commons to come down and help us. So in 2024, we tagged 6 roseate terns and 15 common terns with path track tags, which, as Keenan talked about, go to a base station. And then in 2025, we tagged with path track tags another 24 roseate terns and 16 common terns. And then we also pilot tested Ornatello tags that also upload to the cell phone network. And in 2025, we also had Dr. Johanna Harvey come and do some sampling for disease HPAI on the common terns that we were tagging as well. So this just shows where a typical situation on Great Gull Island, where we were tagging the birds and the roseate terns and in nest box and a terrace. So this is right from a blind. So it's a great place for observation. The red numbered tags are right in front of birds that are occupied by nesting roseate terns. And then the ones with the blue tag, those ones that had a tagged individual too. So we could keep track of the tagged individuals. So the tags average about 2.7% of body mass. We had 10 birds that were previously been banded. So the average age of the birds we were tracking was about 8.5 years old, but ranged up from between 5 to 13 years old. These birds were on a 20-minute duty cycle, 24 hours per day. These were all path track tags that were on roseate terns. And then on the common terns, similar situation, just showing a path track tag in the upper left and an Ornatello tag in the upper right. About 2.5% of body mass. For 9 of the individuals we tagged, the average age was 8 years old, again, between 6 and 13 years old. Again, in a 20-minute duty cycle for the path track tags and 10-minute duty cycle for the Ornatello tags. So this just gives you some indication of the tracking effort. It was a highly successful. These tags are amazing. So it gives you the number of days on average that we track. So a little bit under 2 months for the common terns and a little bit over 2 months for the roseate terns. And we got almost 4,000 individual locations for each of the birds that we tracked. So it was a very impressive data set. So we really get some great high resolution data for the individuals that we're tracking. So I'm just going to dive into some of the data and look at the differences. And so on the left-hand side of the graph, you'll have those two bars represent data collected in 2024. The right-hand bars represent 2025. And then the pinkish purple are the common tern data, and the green bars represent roseate tern data. So one of the obvious things is in 2024, the birds weren't traveling nearly as far from so this is the mean maximum foraging distance from Great Gull Island. So it averaged about a little over 11 kilometers for common terns and about 10 kilometers for roseate terns in 2024. In 2025, there was a much more bimodal pattern. The foraging distances were essentially twice as far in 2025 compared to 2024, averaging about 20 kilometers. If you look at how those movements changed over time, and so again, we have the upper graph represents 2024, the lower one 2025, common tern shown in purple. You can see in 2024 that over time, the foraging distances remain constant throughout the breeding season, going from, this is the chick rearing period from about the 9th of June to the 9th of July. So it stayed relatively constant at about 10 kilometers from the island. In 2025, it started out about 10 kilometers from the island, but over time, those birds were going farther and farther in their foraging distances from Great Gull Island. And the interesting thing is you can see that both common and roseate terns show extremely similar patterns in the distances that they're foraging over time during the chick rearing period. So I have these data broken down into 3 periods. So these first set of graphs represent the incubation period. So we tried to tag the birds about 10 days before the eggs hatched. So that's what these data represent. And I have here, based on kernel density estimates, the core foraging areas and was a 50% utilization distribution, and then shown in the dark spots, and then the lighter coloration is the full home range at about a 90% utilization distribution. So the two upper panels represent common terns, the 2 lower panels in green are roseate terns. If you look at the left-hand panels in 2024, you can see that the core home ranges and the full home ranges are very similar between these 2 species. And what's clearly evident in 2025, both species expanded their range slightly during the incubation period. It wasn't a major change. When it does change is during the chick rearing period, which is this graph. So again, left-hand bars panels represent 2024, right-hand panels 2025. You can see in 2024, the core foraging areas are very similar between common terns and roseate terns. And most of that movement, for those of you who know this part of Long Island Sound, is going from Great Gull Island, the star, to the west towards Orient Point, where was the core foraging area. In 2025, that's a distance of about 10 kilometers, typical foraging. In 2025, you can see that the home ranges of both the core and the full home ranges increased dramatically. And in 2025, there was a lot more movement. Birds were more likely to forage towards the tip of Long Island, near Montauk, Montauk, New York, which is about 26 kilometers. And then also you notice if you look at they're much more likely to move up the coast towards Connecticut. And then they're also much more likely to move to forage over, this is Block Island, that island on the right-hand side. So that's about a 45-kilometer trip that they were having to make in the chick rearing period in 2025. So much larger home ranges during the 2025 period. If you look at the results, so in 2024, we were averaging 1.9 fledglings per nest for common terns and 1.6 fledglings per nest and for roseate terns, and much lower reproductive success in 2025 at about 1.1 fledglings for common terns and a slightly lower reproductive rate of 1.45 fledglings per nest for roseate terns. So 2024 was a good fish year, 2025 was a poor fish year. In the post-breeding period, this is where the differences between the two species really become evident. So of the 24 roseate terns we have active tracks for, 96% of them dispersed to Cape Cod during the post-breeding season. So these are after their chicks have fledged. And the tagged birds spend an average of 23 days at the Cape, as opposed to the common terns, which were shown in purple. They're much more likely to go into Long Island Sound and farther east. Only a little bit under half of those common terns made it to Cape Cod, and they only spent about 2 days at Cape Cod before they left Cape Cod. So dramatically differences in behavior and their staging behavior. This just shows the differences in home ranges in the post-breeding season between 2024 and 25, much larger home ranges detected in 2025, particularly on the Cape. And if you zoom out a little bit, as Keenan just alluded to, so the green line represents a roseate tern. So they left straight from Cape Cod, headed due south. The difference is the common terns, the ones that we have the tracks for, they left Great Gull Island essentially directly and due south and followed the coastline down. So they didn't, so major differences in the post-breeding dispersal of common terns as opposed to roseate terns. If you look at crossing the wind lease areas, 30% of the common terns and 21% of the roseate terns crossed wind lease areas. And if you look at locations per individual, about 0.4% of the locations were in wind lease areas for common terns, and a much smaller fraction, only 0.06%, were detected in wind lease areas for roseate terns. These are only for southbound migration. We don't have data for the birds that we tagged in northbound migration. Keenan and Rafael have those information, those data. And then finally, the migration. So the one thing that you haven't seen yet is common tern dispersal from Great Gull Island. You can see that one individual made it down to North Carolina, a little bit north of North Carolina, and headed south. As another individual went down to the edge of Georgia and left from South Carolina. So differences, these are southbound migratory routes for common terns shown in purple. So differences between common terns and roseate terns in their post-breeding dispersal. And then finally, if you just look at the overlap, just to summarize, this is a proportion overlap between roseate terns and common terns. So if you look at roseate terns in the breeding season, there's a high degree of overlap in the areas that roseate terns use if you look at the areas used by common terns. So during the breeding season, common terns are a good surrogate for roseate terns. In the post-breeding season, there's not much overlap between these two species. So common terns do not serve as a good surrogate for roseate terns during the post-breeding season. And if you look at overlap between years, remember 2024 was a year when they didn't have very large home ranges, so 2025 does a good job of describing the movements in 2024. So if you kind of, just to summarize, there's a high degree of overlap in the core and full home ranges for common terns and roseate terns during the breeding season. There's a lot of synchrony in the annual variation of daily movements between these two species. But the major difference is there's little overlap in the core or full home ranges for common terns and roseate terns during the post-breeding season. So common terns can serve as a surrogate for roseate terns if you're interested in just a breeding season movements. If you're looking at annual variation in foraging hotspots, common terns don't serve as a good surrogate, at least for birds breeding on Great Gull Island. I'm going to qualify that for birds breeding on Great Gull Island during the post-breeding season. So, and I'm sure when other studies from the data from other colonies are seen, we'll be interested to see what the patterns are for other colonies. So, thank you.
Thanks so much, Peter. That was great. I don't think that we have any time for questions right now, but hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end. I think we'll jump over to Liz Craig's talk, which will be evaluating effects of attaching GPS tags using leg loop harnesses on common and roseate terns in the Northwest Atlantic. Go ahead, Liz.
Are you guys seeing my slides?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, great. All right, thanks for that introduction, Keenan. One moment while I figure out my slides. Here we go. So the data I'm presenting today were compiled across a 3-state tagging effort, most of which we've heard about in the last hour, which is great. Each state collected similar data independently, and I'm sharing sort of emerging trends from all 3 states today regarding potential tag effects on birds. So since most of my colleagues are here today, it'll be great. They can help field any questions related to their data. And I also want to particularly thank the field crews in these collaborating states for joining forces, and the collaborators themselves for joining forces on this. And of course, as a multi-state, multi-research program collaboration, we have a lot of institutions to acknowledge and thank for support of this research. And so I've represented many of them here. So there's a long history of different types of tag deployment and attachment methods on terns. And today I'm speaking specifically about GPS tags deployed using leg loop harnesses constructed from this Stretch Magic elastic cord on common and roseate terns. And I'm specifically going to focus on roseate terns for this particular audience. I'm also focusing on adult terns trapped and tagged at the breeding colonies, so not including those birds tagged in Brazil. And as you guys have heard, our group has been deploying this specific harness configuration with Stretch Magic on a lot of birds. We started with this configuration in 2021, and in these past few years, it's been used on hundreds of individual terns across 3 different tern species at least. And that's just in our Northwest Atlantic region. So the method has gained a lot of traction, making it all the more important for us to understand potential reproductive and behavioral consequences of tagging. And I've shared at the bottom here a few references, first describing the leg loop harness technique generally, but also including research conducted by Dee Prosser's group on the effects of this specific harness configuration on common tern adults and chicks in Maryland. So today I want to share with you a brief summary of some of the research we've conducted on responses of common terns, which will be a repetition of the summary we shared last year, and then dive into some of the new results of our 2025 update on tag effects in roseate terns from Maine, New Hampshire, and New York breeding colonies. So for our common tern tag effect summary, I'll start with data we collected in New Hampshire. And over a 5-year period, we deployed 70 tags at the Isles of Shoals Tern colony in New Hampshire. And we have here graphs indicating reproductive responses of terns, comparing nests at which one bird was tagged relative to nests at which no birds were tagged. And we found no significant differences in productivity here on the left or in the growth rate of chicks here on the right between GPS tagged nests and nests with no tagging. Our group also conducted chick provisioning observations at these nests and found no significant differences in feeding rates here on the left or in the proportions of different prey species fed to the chicks at nests where one parent was tagged relative to no tagging. So overall, we've observed that birds wearing these harnesses look and behave relatively normal. I know of only one exception to this, which was a common tern tag that I deployed in 2022 at the New Hampshire site. When I deployed it, the harness was noticeably but only slightly loose, and the adult was able to catch a toe on the harness material, making it difficult for it to walk. So we recaptured that bird and removed the harness, and the bird was not injured. We released it without a tag. But that's the only visible issue we observed in New Hampshire in the 70 tags that we've deployed using Stretch Magic. And I haven't heard of any other issues using Stretch Magic harnesses in the rest of the group, as far as I'm aware. Now, concerning return rates, we're now in a position to start thinking about return rates since we're several years into this study. And we don't have a strong estimate of expected return rates for common terns in this population because the proportion of field-readable banded individuals in this population is relatively low for common terns. But Alia Caldwell summarized return rates of tagged common terns for her recent publication in Waterbirds. And she found a 60 to 70% recite rate of tagged adults in a span of 3 to 8 years after tag deployment at 2 of the colony sites in her study. Okay, so on to our Roseate Tern results. So here I've summarized the number of adult Roseate Terns tagged at each of our study sites over the first few pilot years of this work. These included the 3 largest roseate tern nesting colonies in the Gulf of Maine, up here, plus Great Gull Island in New York, down here. And this past year, we were permitted to deploy 10 tags at each of the Gulf of Maine colonies, and New York was permitted to tag 24 adults at Great Gull Island. I should also mention that in 2024, so the year before last, we trapped and released an additional 6 adult roseate terns with no tags at Stratton Island and in New Hampshire to serve as a trapped control group. And this will be relevant for our results on feeding as well as recite rates in 2025. So all these adults were captured using treadle traps or bow nets at the nest. We trapped and tagged 1 adult at each nest and then observed their the bird's behavior from observation blinds and from cameras. So the response metrics that we were measuring included any visible harness or tag issues like I described earlier for common terns, reproductive success measures, chick provisioning measures, recite rates. And overall, we were comparing the 3 groups, depending on the metric. We might have had all 3 or 2 of them. The tagged or nests at which 1 adult was tagged, the trapped control group, and then the general monitored population. And we compared tagged and trapped control parents to their unhandled mates for chick provisioning comparisons and when possible to look at potential mate compensation if there might be reduced provisioning from tagged adults that aren't apparent at the overall nest level. Okay, so here's our results. So most broadly, we observed no visible harness or tag issues and no nest abandonment at any of the tag nests in either year. And here are the data for reproductive success. And I should say that there were no significant differences in productivity between tag nests and the monitored population for each site and each year when looked at pairwise. And what you can see here is that overall, reproductive success at these nests, whether tagged or in the monitored population, was relatively good in these years and at these sites, generally at or above 1 chick per nest, which is pretty good for these birds. So that's encouraging. On to chick provisioning. Here, comparing tagged nests to the population control groups at the nest level. In New York, they found no significant differences in feeding rates in either year that they observed. And in New Hampshire, we only observed it in 2025 relative to the population, but we also found no significant difference in feeding rates between tagged nests and the overall monitored population. Here I want to mention Grace Guo's analysis from their 2024 senior thesis comparing tagged adults or tagged nests versus trapped control nests. Now, at the nest level, which is comparing the trapped control nests to the tag nests, Grace found no significant difference between of feeding rates between those two groups at the whole nest level, sort of similar to what I just mentioned relative to the population in the previous slide. Grace then looked at the individual level and compared tagged adults to their mates and the trapped control adults to their unhandled mates. And Grace, these are the t-tests associated with those comparisons. Again, Grace found no significant differences in feeding rates between members of these pairs. So no evidence of reductions in individual provisioning effort or mate compensation for that rate. And so those are the data from 2024. In New Hampshire, we found similar results in 2025 in our preliminary analysis, but Grace is currently working with the data sets from all 3 states to compile a combined analysis of chick provisioning rates in this manner. So for our resite summary here, I'm showing the proportion of adults from each of our sites and each treatment in 2024 that were recited again in 2025, 1 year later. So hopefully that makes sense. You'll notice that there are pairs of bars for each observation. So the left-hand bar for each of those pairs indicates the encounter rate of birds that were seen again at the breeding colony where they were originally tagged 1 year later. And the right-hand bar indicates the encounter rate of birds that were seen anywhere, either at the breeding colony, at a different breeding colony, or in Cape Cod 1 year later. So after 1 year, the tagged bird recite rates, which are the black bars, ranged from 40% in New Hampshire to 65% in New York. The trapped control nests or birds, which were in the dark gray bars at the 2 places where we did the trap control at Staten Island and in New Hampshire. In both cases, it was an 80% return rate or recite rate at those 2 sites. And then we also sampled a subset of the monitored population from 2024 in the light gray bars, and we found in 2025 that reciting of that subset of the population ranged from 50% in New Hampshire to 100% in New York. And I want to note also that over here, if you look at New Hampshire, the tagged black bars, you'll see that 0 out of 5 or none of the tagged New Hampshire birds were observed again on the breeding colony the following summer, but Jeff did spot 2 out of 5 of those birds on Cape Cod. So that is a little bit different from observations at other sites. And for reference, Jeff Spendelow and colleagues in 1995 estimated annual adult survival probabilities of somewhere between, I think it was 75 to 85%. And in that context, the tagged bird recite rate here of 40 to 65% is a bit low, but it's also really difficult to know how to interpret these recite results given that the very low sample size of birds that we tagged in 2024. Luckily, we tagged more birds in 2025 and we'll be able to have a larger sample size moving forward. Audubon conducted a bootstrap resampling approach to quantify return rates in Maine, and we would be interested in pursuing that approach as a larger group to help address, again, these challenges of small sample size. And then also getting back to what Kayla had been talking about earlier in the day, a more robust understanding of detection rates and interannual survival rates and colony switching rates would also be really helpful for us to be able to interpret these results. So our major takeaways here were generally encouraging. We had no visible harness or tag issues on any of the roseate terns we tagged. No significant tag effects observed on reproductive success or provisioning behavior, but we did observe lower return rates of tagged birds relative to control birds. So for next steps, we want to take a look at the sex of tagged birds to account for influence of sex on provisioning rates, particularly because male roseate terns are known to provision at higher rates on average than females. And even though we found no significant differences in many of our metrics, we really recognize that we have limited statistical power given our small sample size at each site. So we're interested in undertaking more combined statistical analyses of these data to overcome some of those challenges. And as I mentioned, Grace Grow is starting that effort with chick provisioning data. And finally, we're excited to add to this analysis through additional concerted recite efforts of birds tags the last few years, both at the breeding colonies and at the staging grounds in Cape Cod, as well as new tag deployments in 2026 as permitted for New Hampshire and Maine, and there are no plans for roseate tern tagging in New York in 2026. So with that, again, I want to thank my colleagues who've contributed data to this, and I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Liz. And thanks for taking the time and effort to pull all this together. I think this is a really important thing for us to consider as we move forward with this work. So it's great to see everything coming together. And at least there's some really good positive signs about impacts during the breeding season. And there's more to learn about the return rates and interannual survival. With that, I think that we'll have a little bit of time for questions for Liz. And we have a total of probably about like 10 to 12 more minutes for general questions for any of our speakers or discussion points. So if anybody has a question, feel free to jump in. Otherwise, I will carry on with some other discussion points. Go ahead, Sarah.
Hi, Liz. I was curious whether you have ever recaught any of your tagged birds. And I ask because I don't know all of the details off the top of my head, but I know the bird that was captured on North Brother that had been tagged in Brazil, they did note when they removed the tag and the harness that there was some like chafing and feather loss around where the harness and the tag were sitting. That weren't necessarily visible like from observations. It was only once the bird was in the hand and you could really inspect. And I'm just curious if you guys were able to recapture any birds.
That's a great question, and I'll encourage Peter and Keenan also if you want to share your experiences. We've probably removed at this point 3 maybe between common and roseate terns, 3 tags of one of which was not on for very long. So I've never seen any issues related to chafing. And I would say that, and I can see Dee Prosser is still here. Dee in some of their groups vetting of different harness materials looked carefully at chafing as a response. So I guess I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I can chime in a little bit and share our experience as well in Maine. I think we've probably recaptured somewhere between probably like 8 and 12 Arctic terns that have held on to tags for a year. And I think probably around 3 to 5 common terns at this point that have held on to their tags for a full year. with almost all those birds, we didn't see like really obvious signs of chafing where there was scabs or reddish kind of marks on the skin. But on the back underneath the tag, what we saw more of, which is probably a result of chafing, was that a lot of the feather growth under the tag was stunted. And that's been at varying levels. I think it's not surprising that we put the tag on prior to body molt, that something like this would happen. And especially during body molt, my guess is that that skin probably becomes very irritated underneath the tag. So I think it would be good to explore options of how we could create a better situation for the bird, though I think it's just a complicated approach and may be a side effect of these tags. The one other thing that I'll add is that in addition to looking underneath the tag, we've also kind of looked up in their leg pits, as I call them, where the leg loop actually goes up. And we have not observed any obvious chafing or feather loss in that area on birds that have held onto the tag for a year.
Okay, thanks. And I guess just to clarify, maybe chafing was not the right word to use because I don't think there was like scabs or anything. It was just like more just like bare patches of skin where feather growth definitely was being affected.
Yeah.
As far as I remember. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So just interesting to hear that other people have seen that as well.
Yep. And then Julie also mentioned that some of the stretch magic seemed to have been discolored and was kind of a pinkish color. And we've seen that on all of our tags as well. So my gut feeling of what could be going on is that soon after deployment, when the bird is kind of getting used to having the harness, there's probably some sort of initial chafing going on, and perhaps there's some sort of bleeding, and it could be minimal. My guess is it's very minimal, but it still gets soaked up by this elastic material. There's probably some porous quality to that material that stays there. But from what we've seen, they seem to heal well from whatever that is. But it would be great to have more studies done on this, like Dee Prosser and her group have done. Yeah, and maybe if she has anything to add to this, that would be great.
Yeah, I don't want to speak on like Jen's behalf, but I think we're pretty keen to like share results wherever it makes sense on things like that. So
yeah. Go ahead, Caleb.
Sorry about that. My mouse wasn't working very well. Okay. I have a question, I guess, for Keenan and really for everyone who might have looked into this. There have been a fair number of tern species that have used the leg loop harness in the past. And I'm wondering if there have been any more, studies with higher sample sizes looking at tag effects. Do you guys know, Liz and Keenan and Don, I know, is on, and he's tagged a lot of birds with that technique. I'm just curious if there are other studies that you know of.
Liz, do you want to go?
On the spot? I can't recall the sample size, to be honest. I'm sorry, because there are some great papers out there. But the specific question about sample size is a little hard for me to dredge up from my brain.
Yeah, I wasn't necessarily looking for an exact sample size. I was just looking for a larger sample size from which to.
Well, certainly we have much larger sample size for our common tern work than for our roseate tern work, as does the group in Maryland. In New Hampshire, our analysis were based on 70 tags, and we have more now. So I think it's the super small sample sizes that are tough, especially when you're looking at proportion data. They're just so influenced by every individual animal.
Yeah, definitely. And it looked variable to cross-site, I guess, in large part because of its sample size. So that's really interesting too.
The other thing I'll just add here is that the work that Liz is leading with Grace is quite novel in the realm of tag effects. There are not many papers that have really dug in, especially to the provisioning rates. So I think that this group is taking a much finer look and going beyond just interannual survival and survival within a single breeding season to really understand what's going on here. So I think that's one of the most exciting parts of the work Liz is leading.
Yeah, definitely. That is very cool and hard to do in some other species. So yeah, that's very cool.
The other thing I would throw out there is that we're talking about terns in the size range of 115 to 140 grams. So looking at other species like Caspian tern, for example, a much larger species. So it's a kind of a different issue too.
Yeah, that's true. Definitely.
Do we have any other questions? If not, I might put Rafa on the spot and ask if he could just share a quick update about power line collisions in Brazil.
Yeah. So we market and have been monitoring the power lines, the two main power lines that identified the collisions in the past 4 years. And the results right now for the beach power line, for the 4 years that have been already marked, it's a big reduction, like it's around not over 90% of the birds of the reduction in collisions, but we still can find some kind of collisions happening in some specific spots. We are now trying to take a look in obtaining of the material of the markers, and changing the ones that just fell out. So, and in this year in particular, it's a moment, like a critical moment for this project that have been monitoring. We are just with weekly monitoring right now, instead of daily monitoring as we have been doing the last years, due to financial support. But we put some volunteers together to at least assess the any other collision happening, especially in the road power line is the power line that we mark.